In 1943, a 30-year-old Army cryptanalyst named Meredith Gardner sat in a small office at Arlington Hall in Virginia and stared at a pile of Soviet diplomatic cables that everyone in the intelligence community had already agreed were unbreakable. The Soviets used a one-time pad encryption system. A one-time pad, when used correctly, produces theoretically perfect secrecy. No mathematician on Earth could crack it. Meredith Gardner cracked it anyway. Not because he was more gifted than every mathematician who had tried before him, because the Soviets had made one mistake in 1942 that no amount of mathematical brilliance could correct. They had reused the pads. That mistake opened a window into the most sensitive intelligence operation in American history. What Gardner and a small team of cryptanalysts began pulling out of those cables over the next several years would confirm the existence of a Soviet spy network so deep inside the United States government that the people responsible for national security had no idea how far it reached. The program was called VENONA. It would operate in total secrecy for 37 years. In that time, it would identify over 300 individuals working inside the United States government on behalf of Soviet intelligence. And it would never be shared with the President of the United States. Think about what that means. The most consequential counterintelligence operation in American history, run by cryptanalysts who had cracked the uncrackable code, identifying traitors at the highest levels of American power. And the men running it decided the president could not be trusted with what they had found. The VENONA program began officially on February 1, 1943. The Army Signal Intelligence Service had been collecting Soviet diplomatic cable traffic since 1939. The cables sat undecoded, a wall of mathematical noise that American cryptanalysts treated as an exercise in futility. Soviet one-time pads were the gold standard of wartime encryption. Each message received a unique numerical key, used once and then destroyed. Without the key, interception is useless. You could collect every cable the Soviets ever sent and still know nothing. Then a clerk in the Soviet communications system in New York made a decision that changed the outcome of the Cold War before anyone knew the Cold War had started. Facing a wartime paper shortage, someone in the Soviet procurement chain authorized the reuse of one-time pad pages. The same key material was duplicated and sent to more than one communications station. When Gardner identified overlapping key sequences across different cables in 1944, the mathematical barrier that had made those messages permanently secure suddenly was not. He began with a fragment, a partially decoded cable from 1944 that referenced something called enormaz, the Soviet code name for the Manhattan Project. Inside that message were the outlines of a spy network with active sources inside American weapons research. Within months, Gardner had identified cables referencing agents in the State Department, the Treasury, the OSS, the Department of Justice, and the War Department. The names attached to them were not low-level clerks or filing assistants. They were senior officials, policy advisors, economists, and diplomats operating at the center of American strategic planning. Alger Hiss appeared in the cables under the code name AILS. Hiss had been present at every major wartime Allied conference. He helped organize the Yalta Summit. He was the senior State Department official most responsible for drafting the founding charter of the United Nations. The VENONA cables placed him briefing Soviet military intelligence officers in Washington while simultaneously serving as a principal American negotiator. Harry Dexter White, the architect of the International Monetary Fund, appeared in the cables under the code names jurist and lawyer. Julius Rosenberg appeared under the code name Liberal, running a network of sources inside American atomic weapons research. Donald Maclean, a British diplomat with access to Anglo-American nuclear cooperation agreements, appeared under the code name Homer. These were not peripheral figures passing inconsequential documents. They were the people inside the American and British governments who had helped design the architecture of the post-war world. And VENONA had their names. Here is where the story should have had a clean resolution. A government learns its institutions have been penetrated, it arrests the traitors, it closes the networks, it publishes what it knows. That is not what happened. What happened instead became one of the most carefully maintained secrets in American intelligence history. The analysts running VENONA decided almost immediately that the program itself could not be disclosed, not to Congress, not to the Justice Department, not to J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, at least not in any complete or official form, and not to Harry Truman. The reason for keeping it from Truman was particular and alarming. By the late 1940s, VENONA analysts and the small number of officials with access to the program had reason to believe that people close to Truman's own advisors had been identified in the cables. The fear was that informing the president through normal channels risked that information reaching compromised officials before arrests could be made. The irony was exact and devastating. The reason VENONA could not be shared was that VENONA had already revealed how many people at the highest levels of the American government were sharing things with Moscow. There was a second problem, and it came close to destroying the entire program. In 1949, a British intelligence officer named Kim Philby arrived in Washington as the formal liaison between British intelligence and the CIA. Philby was one of the most trusted and decorated intelligence officers in the Western world. He was also a Soviet agent. Recruited at Cambridge in the 1930s, he had spent his entire career feeding classified material to Moscow. When Philby was briefed on VENONA existence and scope, he reported it to his KGB handlers within days. Moscow immediately began moving its most exposed sources away from positions where the decoded cables could reach them. Donald Maclean fled to the Soviet Union in 1951, hours before British counterintelligence moved to make the arrest. Guy Burgess, another Cambridge recruit, left with him. Philby came under heavy suspicion, resigned from British intelligence that same year, and defected to Moscow in 1963. By the time he was gone, the Soviets had been aware of VENONA for 4 years and had used that knowledge to shelter their most valuable remaining sources. And yet the program continued. Gardner and his colleagues kept working through the cables. More names emerged, more networks took shape. More evidence accumulated of a penetration so thorough that when the FBI was eventually briefed informally on portions of what had been found, senior counterintelligence officials initially could not accept the scale of what they were hearing. The picture VENONA was building was not one that any security service is psychologically prepared to absorb. It implied the vetting failures were not occasional and random, but structural. It implied the entire wartime Roosevelt administration had been penetrated at a depth that required deliberate Soviet recruitment and active ongoing management. The Rosenbergs were arrested in 1950 and executed in 1953. Their guilt was fiercely contested in American public life for decades. When VENONA was finally declassified by the NSA in 1995, the cables confirmed Julius Rosenberg had run a network that passed atomic weapons research directly to Moscow. The people who had spent years insisting the Rosenbergs were innocent victims of political persecution had been defending individuals the government had known were guilty since 1948, based on evidence it had decided it could not safely make public. The declassification in 1995 produced one of the stranger historical reckonings of the 20th century. Scholars who had spent decades arguing that Cold War anti-communism represented paranoid overreach suddenly had to confront evidence that the paranoia had been substantially grounded in reality. The Soviet penetration of American institutions that McCarthy had ranted about, often crudely and falsely, had in its core factual elements been real, documented in cables that American cryptanalysts had been reading in secret since 1944. Here is what VENONA ultimately established. The Cold War was not a conflict between two roughly symmetrical powers who had failed to understand each other. It was a conflict in which one side had embedded its agents at the precise tables where the other side's strategy was being written. The men who negotiated Yalta, who built the IMF, who coordinated the Allied response to Soviet post-war expansion, several of them were reporting to Moscow while they did it. VENONA did not reveal a handful of isolated bad actors who had slipped past inadequate screening. It revealed a deliberate, coordinated, long-running operation that had achieved penetration at exactly the levels where consequential decisions were made. The cryptanalysts who broke the Soviet codes handed their government proof of all of it. Their government spent 37 years deciding that the proof was too dangerous to share. That decision, made for reasons that made operational sense and that still carry an uncomfortable implication about democratic accountability, meant the full reckoning never arrived. The people named in the cables died. The political arguments moved on. The archives stayed locked. And the country that outlasted the Soviet Union spent most of the Cold War unaware that some of the architects of that winning strategy had been reporting to the other side the entire time.